Apache custom requires that the guests delight all the women of the tribe. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The heat pressed down on the narrow Arizona canyon in a steady, suffocating way that left the air thick and unmoving. And Dawson Hale guided his tired bay horse along the hard-packed trail with the slow, controlled rhythm of a man who had learned to save his strength. Dust clung to his boots, his coat, and the sweat-darkened collar of his blue shirt, and each breath came with a dry scrape in his throat, but he pushed forward because turning back wasn't an option. He had spent 4 years riding alone after leaving the ranch where his younger siblings were killed in a raid, and the empty roads had become the only place he could think without interruption. He wasn't searching for land or work anymore. He stayed moving because stillness forced him to confront things he'd buried, and he didn't have the courage to sit with them yet. The canyon had always been a place he trusted. Tight walls, clear sight lines, no sudden surprises unless the land shifted. His main goal for the day was simple: reach the shallow spring at the end of the canyon, refill water, rest the horse, and camp alone. He planned his days quietly, the way a man did when he had no one to answer to and no one waiting for him. As he rounded a bend between two jagged rock formations, something cut across his vision: brief, shaky movement low to the ground. Dawson froze instinctively, letting the horse settle under him while his eyes adjusted to the glare bouncing off the stone. His pulse tightened with the familiar alertness he carried from a life of unwanted surprises. He waited. The shape moved again, not quickly, but with the weak, uneven motion of someone trying not to fall. He slid off the saddle, kept one hand near his belt, and stepped carefully toward the shape. His boots scraped the ground in a slow, deliberate pattern. The closer he moved, the clearer the figure became. It wasn't an animal, not a settler, not a raider, a young woman. She was kneeling near a boulder, her arms braced against the rock as if holding herself up took everything she had left. Her long black hair hung in tangled strands, sticking to her shoulders. Her deerskin dress was torn across the front, the rip wide enough that the top of her cleavage showed each time she shifted, and she tried repeatedly to pull the fabric together with one shaking hand, but failed because the cloth was too damaged to close. Her legs carried cuts and dirt streaks all the way down to her ankles. She looked half-conscious, breathing in shallow, sharp pulls. Dawson stopped close enough to help, but far enough not to frighten her. His heartbeat steadied with effort. He wasn't afraid of her. His fear came from not knowing what trouble followed her and whether his choice to approach her would invite it. Still, something in her condition pushed him through the hesitation. "You hear me?" he asked quietly. Her head lifted. She blinked several times before her vision focused. Her eyes were wide, dark, and full of exhaustion that went deeper than the heat. She looked at him with the strained tension of someone unsure whether he was a threat or the only chance she had left. He lowered himself into a crouch and set his canteen on the ground between them, nudging it toward her. She didn't touch it at first. She watched his hands, his posture, his breathing. Only when she realized he wasn't moving closer did she reach for the canteen. Her fingers trembled hard as she lifted it, and she drank in small, desperate gulps that showed how long she'd been without water. Droplets spilled down her chin and slipped into the torn opening of her dress, glistening across the exposed part of her chest. She flinched at the sensation and tried to hide herself again, her arm crossing over her cleavage, but her energy wasn't enough to hold the fabric in place. Dawson forced his eyes to stay on her face, not her chest. Her embarrassment was visible in the tightness of her jaw. It stirred something protective in him, the same instinct that had once made him step between his siblings and danger before he failed to save them. He swallowed that memory down and focused only on her. "What happened?" he asked in a low tone. She swallowed hard. Her voice barely rose above the canyon air. "Ritual," she whispered. "Guest must comfort all women. Old rule. I refuse. They chase." Dawson's expression didn't change, but inside he felt a shift. Anger toward the situation, not toward her people. He didn't fully understand her tribe's customs, but he understood what it meant to run because something expected of you didn't make sense anymore. He had done the same after the raid when people insisted he stay and rebuild. They didn't understand how a man carried certain losses. She tried to stand. Her legs buckled immediately, and Dawson reacted before thinking, catching her waist with one strong hand. The moment his palm touched her skin through the torn dress, she inhaled sharply, startled but not resisting. He steadied her, feeling how her muscles trembled from exhaustion. Her body leaned into his lightly, not intentionally, but because she couldn't hold herself upright without help. "Easy," he murmured. Her fingers rose and gripped his sleeve, not in fear, but because her balance was slipping. The contact was warm, shaky, and full of unspoken trust she likely didn't have the energy to question. She looked up at him with a mixture of fear and hope, her breathing uneven. "No, back," she whispered. "I not go back." Dawson studied her carefully. She wasn't lying. She wasn't dramatic. She was terrified, dehydrated, and almost out of strength. And someone was coming after her. He helped her sit against the rock again, making sure she didn't slide down. Her shoulders slumped in relief when she felt the support behind her. Her eyes closed for a moment, as if the world stopped spinning. "My name's Dawson Hale," he said quietly. "I'm passing through. That's all." She opened her eyes again, listening. "You hurt?" he asked. She nodded once. Bruises covered her arms, and her knees looked raw. He took a moment to gather his thoughts. Helping her meant inviting danger, but leaving her meant watching someone collapse alone in the middle of the canyon. The decision formed quickly, pushed by instinct rather than logic. "I'll get you out of here," he said, "but we need to move soon." A faint sound traveled from the canyon mouth, far away but unmistakable. Hoofbeats, light, distant, but enough to raise every hair on Dawson's arms. She heard it too. Panic flashed across her face. Her hand shot out and found his arm again, gripping tighter this time. Dawson scanned the canyon walls, noting possible retreat paths. His mind shifted into the disciplined calm he had learned during the raid years earlier. Evaluate, act, protect. No hesitation. He looked at her again, her chest rising fast, her eyes wide. "You ride with me," he said, voice firm but gentle. "Hold on and don't look back." She nodded slowly, trusting the steadiness in his tone more than the words themselves. He lifted her carefully, guiding her arm over his shoulder as he helped her stand. She winced, but she didn't resist. Her torn dress slipped again as she moved, exposing more of her cleavage than before, as she tried to pull it closed, frustration shaking her hands. Dawson looked away long enough for her to fix whatever she could. When she realized he wasn't staring, her shoulders loosened a little. He led her toward the horse. The hoofbeats echoed again, closer this time. Saharila placed one hand on Dawson's chest, using him for balance. Her fingers pressed against him lightly, but the contact sent a clear message she wasn't strong enough to mount alone. Dawson stepped in. "We go now," he said. He lifted her onto the saddle, climbed up behind her, and wrapped one steady arm around her waist, not tight, just secure enough to keep her from falling. The first real feeling of safety settled across her face as she leaned back against him. He kicked the horse forward, and the canyon swallowed the sound of their departure as they fled into the narrowing shadows ahead. The horse moved fast along the canyon floor, its hooves pounding a steady rhythm that bounced through Saharila's body as she clung to the saddle horn, her back pressed against Dawson's chest. His arm held her steady, not possessive, not hesitant, just firm in the way a man acted when he needed to keep someone alive. She breathed sharply each time the horse shifted under them, her bruised legs tensing in pain, but she didn't ask him to slow because the distant hoofbeats behind them were no longer faint. They carried a sharper edge now, the kind that meant riders were cutting down the trail with intent. Dawson looked over his shoulder only once, long enough to see dust rising at the mouth of the canyon, then leaned forward to guide the horse into a narrow cut between two ridges. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The urgency in his posture told Saharila everything she needed to know. His hand braced her side each time the horse jolted. The contact was steady, warm, and more reassuring than any word she had heard in days. She swallowed hard, trying to calm her breathing. Her mind flicked between fear of being caught and confusion about why this stranger had stepped in without hesitation. Most men she'd encountered wouldn't have picked up trouble this easily. She glanced down at his hand, gripping the reins, and saw the faint scars along his knuckles. They weren't fresh, but they carried a story she didn't understand yet. She wondered what drove him to ride alone. Listeners would probably ask the same. Why a man with strength and discipline lived without a family, without a circle, without even a partner to watch his back. She didn't ask now. The timing wasn't right. Instead, she tried to gather her voice. They catch, they punish, she whispered, struggling to speak over the wind rushing past them. Dawson heard her, but didn't turn. What happens if they do? He asked, keeping his eyes on the trail. She hesitated before answering, as if saying it aloud made it heavier. They take me back. Make me finish ritual. Make me give myself to men I do not choose. Dawson's jaw tightened. His grip on the reins shifted. Nothing in his posture suggested judgment toward her people. His tension came from imagining her trapped in something she clearly feared. He slowed the horse just enough to avoid injuring it on the twisting incline, and his voice stayed steady. "You're not going back," he said. "Not while you're with me." Her breath loosened in her chest for the first time since their escape began. The canyon narrowed further, the path slanting upward toward dry brush and scattered rock. Dawson guided the horse into a crooked line between boulders, using every bit of his memory from past travels to avoid dead ends. Listeners might wonder, how did a cowboy know these forgotten trails so well? Why was he wandering this section of the territory instead of heading toward towns where supplies were easier? The truth was simple but painful. He came here because the land gave him silence, and because no one followed a man who didn't want company. He avoided towns because noise made his grief worse. He stayed moving to keep his mind from drifting to the night he found what was left of his family. He didn't tell her that, but those thoughts thinned his breathing. Saharili sensed something change in him. His shoulders stiffened slightly. She didn't know the reason, but she knew enough about pain to recognize when someone tried to hold it back. Her hand moved from the saddle horn to his forearm on instinct, a small gesture meant to steady herself, but when her fingers pressed against his sleeve, he felt the quiet plea behind it. "You safe?" she asked him softly, surprising herself. He blinked once, not expecting concern from someone being hunted. "I'm fine," he said. "Focus on holding on. This ground's rough." Ahead, the canyon wall broke open into a wider stretch where sunlight hit the dirt in a harsh angle. Dawson slowed the horse and lifted his head to listen. Nothing echoed behind them now. No hoofbeats, no shouts, just the low groan of wind scraping across stone. Saharila looked over her shoulder, uneasy but hopeful. They weren't visible anymore, but she knew the trackers weren't likely to give up. Dawson guided the horse behind a stand of scrub brush and finally brought it to a halt. The animal's sides were slick with sweat. Its breathing came fast. He slid down and helped Saharila dismount, his hands locked around her waist with controlled strength. Her legs trembled the moment her feet touched the ground, and she stumbled into him unintentionally, her forehead brushing his collarbone before she caught herself. Her torn dress shifted again, the damaged neckline hanging lower, and she quickly pulled the cloth up with her free hand. Dawson stepped back just enough to give her privacy while still keeping her within reach if she faltered. She noticed he turned his head slightly away, a gesture that softened her defenses. She leaned against a boulder and drew a slow breath as she gathered her strength. "Why you help me?" she asked quietly. "You owe me nothing." He looked down at the dirt beneath his boots before answering. "I've seen too many people left to fend for themselves when they shouldn't have been," he said. "Didn't sit right leaving you in that canyon." Her shoulders loosened at the honesty in his voice. She slid her fingers along the torn edge of her dress, frustrated at its state. "I have no other clothes," she murmured. "I know," he said. "We'll figure something out when we're clear of danger." She hesitated, then asked something listeners would likely wonder as well. "Where you go before you find me?" Dawson took a slow breath. "I was heading toward the spring at the end of the pass, just looking for a place to rest. I travel alone." Been that way a long time. He didn't say why, and she didn't push him. A sudden crack echoed from the ridge above. A stone dislodged, rolling down a slope. Dawson stepped forward instantly, positioning himself between her and the sound, his hand hovering near his holster. Saharila stiffened but stayed silent. They waited, listening. Another faint scrape followed, not from a rider, but from someone moving too fast across uneven ground. Dawson crouched beside her. "We can't stay here," he said quietly. "Someone's tracking ahead of the others. They're spreading out." Fear rose in her throat, but she swallowed it down. "Where we go?" He pointed toward a narrow split in the rock. "There's an old miner's cut through that wall. Steep, but it'll throw them off. They won't expect us to take it." Her trust grew by the second. She nodded. He took her hand this time, not for comfort, but for navigation, and led her toward Split. Her steps were shaky, but she followed without arguing. Being hunted had drained her pride. Survival came first now. As they moved into the darker break between the rocks, Saharila stumbled again. Dawson caught her elbow, keeping her upright. Her fingers tightened briefly around his hand, a quiet admission she was near her limit. At the far end of the split, the land opened into a wide, sloping basin covered in tall, dry grass and scattered juniper trees. Dawson surveyed it quickly, mapping potential hiding spots and escape lines. He felt her watching him, not with suspicion, but with the kind of hope a person placed in someone who'd already proven steady under pressure. She stepped closer. "I stay with you?" she asked, barely audible. Dawson met her eyes, his expression calm but serious. "You stay until you decide you're safe." She exhaled slowly, relief mixing with uncertainty. And for the first time since he'd found her, she didn't try to cover the torn neckline of her dress. Her hand dropped to her side as her trust in him settled in her posture. Behind them, another faint rumble of hooves rolled through the canyon. Dawson looked toward the sound, then toward the open basin. "We keep moving," he said. "This isn't over yet." Dawson led Saharila across the dry basin with long, controlled strides, checking every rise in the ground before committing to it, his eyes flicking between the horizon and the thin trail behind them where the sound of hooves still rolled faintly through the air. The grass shifted around their legs in stiff, sun-dried sways, and each step sent small clouds of dust rising around their ankles. Saharila stayed close, her breathing shallow and uneven, her legs moving with the strained determination of someone forcing their body to cooperate even though it wanted to collapse. Her torn dress brushed against her thighs as she walked, and she kept one hand near the rip in the neckline in case it slipped lower, but she no longer tried to hide out of shame, only practicality. They reached a slanted ridge covered in juniper trees, and Dawson stopped long enough to scan the land behind them. Nothing moved yet, but he knew trackers could travel quietly when needed. He motioned for Saharila to follow as he climbed the incline, choosing a path that kept them hidden beneath the reach of the thicker branches. She used the rock to balance herself, her fingers gripping the rough surface while her other hand pressed gently against her ribs where bruises had formed from running through brush earlier. When they reached a ledge halfway up, Dawson knelt beside a cluster of stones. He shifted a few branches aside to reveal a narrow indentation in the rock, an old observation niche miners once used when scouting for new seams. It was cramped but hidden from every angle except directly below. Saharila sank onto the cool stone with a trembling exhale, her shoulders falling as if relieved to finally stop. Dawson crouched in front of her, studying her distress. "You need rest," he said, his tone steady but firm. "You're close to dropping." She shook her head first, then corrected herself. "Few minutes," she murmured. "Not long." Dawson didn't argue. He pulled his canteen from his belt and handed it to her. She drank slowly, her hands steadier than before, but still weak. The cool water brought a faint color back to her cheeks. "Why you alone?" she asked after a moment, her voice quiet, as if she was finally brave enough to ask the question listeners would have wondered since the beginning. "Why you no travel with others?" Dawson rested his forearms on his knees as he sat in front of her. His gaze settled on the basin below before he answered. "My family was taken in a raid," he said, not raising his voice. All of them. I stayed behind after it happened, tried to rebuild, but the place never felt like home after that. Too many memories. Too many reminders. He exhaled slowly. So I left. She absorbed that explanation carefully, her expression softening as she watched him. You think running helped? She asked. Didn't help, he said. But staying didn't either. I ride until the days feel quiet enough to bear. Saharila lowered her gaze. She understood loss, even if she didn't understand his particular kind of grief. My mother died last winter, she said. I'm not ready for ritual. They say I must accept or shame clan. I run because I feel wrong inside. Her chest tightened as she breathed, and Dawson noticed. He shifted slightly closer. They'll stop looking at some point, he said. People don't chase forever. She looked at him with tired honesty. My clan does. A sudden crack of sound rose from the far edge of the basin. Someone snapping a dry branch. Saharila tensed instantly, her fingers clutching Dawson's coat sleeve as fear returned with sharp clarity. Dawson eased her hand down gently, but kept his eyes fixed on the basin. He reached for his rifle, resting it across his knee. A lone rider appeared between the tall grasses, moving slowly, circling the area with practiced caution. The man carried a short spear on his back and a small pouch at his waist, his hair tied with thin leather. He wasn't searching blindly. He tracked with intention, pausing every time he spotted disturbed grass or loose soil. Saharila's breath hitched softly. He is scout, she whispered. Better than others. He follows sign fast. Dawson watched the rider with a tight jaw. The scout dismounted near the ridge base, crouched, and pressed his palm to the ground. He studied a faint print, likely their horses, and lifted his head toward the incline with unsettling precision. Dawson leaned closer to Saharila and whispered, Stay behind me. Don't move unless I say. Her heart pounded hard enough for her to hear it. She shifted her body back into the deepest part of the niche, pulling her bruised legs toward herself. Dawson positioned himself at the edge of the ledge, rifle ready but still lowered. He didn't want to shoot anyone unless there was no other choice. He had enough ghosts behind him. The scout began climbing, using the footholds with careful placement. Dawson calculated quietly. The man didn't know exactly where they were, but he was confident enough to check the ridge. Saharila's breathing quickened. She covered her mouth to keep any sound from slipping out. Dawson looked at her and gave a small nod, just enough reassurance to anchor her. She held the stone wall with both hands, trying to steady her trembling. Halfway up, the scout paused. He studied a cracked branch Dawson had brushed against earlier. He turned his head, then looked directly toward the niche, close enough to sense movement, but not close enough to see them yet. Dawson lifted the rifle slightly. His finger rested near the trigger, not on it. He took one slow breath, preparing for whatever came next. Suddenly, a sharp whistle echoed from the basin, another rider calling the scout back. The scout straightened immediately, scanning the ridge one last time, then descended with quick, efficient movements. He mounted his horse and rode toward the voice. Saharila's breath finally released. Her shoulders dropped, her palms sliding off the stone from the sweat gathering in them. She looked at Dawson with visible relief, layered over deep fear. They almost find us, she whispered. Almost doesn't count, he said quietly. But the tension in his voice made it clear they were far from safe. He scanned the land again, then turned back to her. We can't stay in the open anymore, he said. They'll widen the search next. Where we go? She asked, her voice softer now. There's a dry wash north of here, he said. Old miners carved a camp under the rock shelf years ago. It's hidden and hard to track. We can rest there longer than a few minutes. She pulled herself upright with slow effort. Dawson steadied her elbow without thinking. The touch made her shiver, not from fear but from the strain in her legs. What about your horse? She asked suddenly, realizing listeners might wonder this too. How a single horse carried two people through rough terrain without rest. He can handle it, Dawson said. I've ridden him through worse. He's strong. She looked at the horse below with a new kind of respect. Dawson helped her down the ledge, supporting her weight when she slipped on loose sand. Her fingers gripped his arm, steadying herself. Each step felt heavier, but she didn't complain. When they reached the basin floor again, she paused long enough to stare at the direction the scout had gone. "They not stop," she whispered. "I know," Dawson said, tightening his grip on her waist just briefly. "That's why we stay ahead of them." He lifted her onto the horse once more, her hands resting against his chest for balance, her body leaning into his as exhaustion pulled at her. As Dawson climbed up behind her, the lingering heat, the distant riders, and the weight of their choices settled around them. But neither of them hesitated. They rode toward the dry wash. Deeper into land, neither could face alone. The ride toward the dry wash was rougher than anything Saharila had experienced that day. The horse pushing through tall grass and loose soil, while Dawson held the reins in one hand and kept his other arm around her waist to keep her steady as the land sloped downward in uneven dips. The fading light cast long shadows across the ground, making it harder to see where the terrain changed, and each sudden shift sent a jolt up through the saddle into her sore muscles. She clenched her jaw to keep from crying out, not wanting to slow them down, but Dawson felt the tension in her body and guided the horse with more care. The dry wash opened beneath a row of jagged rocks, its floor a mixture of sand, broken stone, and scattered debris from long-gone mining gear. Dawson slowed as he approached the northern edge where the rock shelf curved inward, forming a shallow natural overhang. As soon as the horse stepped inside the shade, the temperature dropped several degrees, giving Saharila a moment of relief. Dawson dismounted first and helped her down carefully, his hands gripping her waist with a controlled steadiness. Her legs almost gave out the moment her boots touched the ground, and she grabbed his arm to keep from falling. He steadied her without comment, though concern tightened the corners of his eyes. She didn't miss it. "What this place?" she asked, her voice rough from the long ride. "Old shelter miners used," Dawson said, glancing around the carved-out space. "Most folks don't know it's here. That's why it's useful." The listeners would likely have wondered something now. Why Dawson knew these hidden paths and abandoned structures so well, considering he wasn't a miner. The truth revealed itself as he walked toward a rusted metal bucket half buried in the sand. "My father worked these hills when I was a kid," Dawson said, crouching to examine the ground. "He took me out here to show me how men lived when they had nothing but a pick and hope." He ran his fingers across an old tool mark in the stone. "I learned the trails because they were the first places I came after the raid. I didn't want people to know where I went." Saharila watched his jaw tighten with memory, understanding now why isolation came naturally to him. "You come here to hide?" "Not exactly," he said. "I came here to breathe." She didn't know the full weight behind that sentence, but the sincerity in it struck her deeply. Dawson scanned the wash again, checking every gap in the stone. "We can rest here for a while," he said. "You need time, and the horse does too." The horse lowered its head into the sand, blowing out warm air. Saharila reached to touch its neck, her fingers brushing the coarse mane. "He's strong," she said softly. "He's stubborn," Dawson corrected with a faint hint of dry humor, one of the first signs of levity since they met. Saharila moved toward the rock wall, her legs trembling. When she sank onto the ground, she winced sharply, her hand flying to her thigh where a bruise had deepened. Dawson knelt in front of her without hesitation. "You're hurt more than you said," he murmured. She exhaled slowly. "I feel pain in all places," she admitted, "but no break." His eyes scanned her carefully, checking her posture and the way she held herself. "You ran a long way for someone injured," he said, not as judgment, but as acknowledgement of her strength. She lifted her gaze to his. "Fear makes body run," she said. Dawson knew the truth in that better than most. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a strip of cloth, clean and unused. "You'll need this," he said, nodding toward the torn neckline of her dress. "You don't have to tie it now, but it'll give you something to work with until we find you proper clothing." She took the cloth with both hands, her eyes softening with gratitude. She pressed it to her chest in a small gesture of thanks. "You kind," she said quietly. "Most men see torn dress and think wrong thing." Dawson's expression stayed steady. "I've seen enough hurt in my life," he said. "I don't need to add to yours." She studied him for a long moment, realizing she had met men who never looked her in the eyes, only at her body. But Dawson showed nothing but respect. That alone made her chest feel lighter. Another question lingered. One listeners might have wondered too. My clan, she said, her breath uneven. Why they follow so far? Why not stop? Dawson sat beside her, leaning his back against the rock. Because you refuse something they consider tradition, he said. People chase what they call honor, even when it hurts someone. She lowered her head. I shame them. You didn't shame anyone, Dawson replied, his voice firmer than before. You made a choice. That's not shame. Her throat tightened, not from fear, but from the unexpected comfort in his tone. Suddenly, a distant metallic clatter echoed from the far end of the wash, something striking stone. Dawson stiffened instantly and rose to his feet, scanning the shadows outside the shelter. Saharila's heart kicked in her chest as she pushed herself upright, gripping the wall for balance. Dawson lifted a hand to quiet her, then stepped toward the edge of the overhang. The sunlight outside had dimmed into the orange of late afternoon, making the rocks glow, but the far side of the wash carried movement. A small group of quail burst from a bush, scattering across the sand. Just birds. Dawson exhaled a breath he'd been holding. False alarm, he said, but his expression didn't ease fully. He knew they were still being tracked. Men disciplined enough to chase through harsh land rarely turned back early. Saharila touched his sleeve lightly. They find us soon? Not if we move again before dark, he said. But you need to eat something first. She nodded, realizing she hadn't eaten since dawn. Dawson pulled a small canvas bundle from his bag and unfolded it, revealing strips of dried venison and a piece of hard bread. He handed them to her. She ate slowly, each bite careful and small. Dawson watched the way her shoulders eased as her hunger weakened, and he knew she needed more rest than she'd admit. You're safe for the moment, he said quietly, but tonight will be hard. They'll fan out. They're disciplined. You know them? She asked, surprised. I know how people move when they think someone owes them obedience, he said, his tone darkening with memory. Outlaws, soldiers, townsfolk. Doesn't matter the group. They act the same. She studied him, wondering what exactly he had witnessed in his past. What you do before the raid? She asked suddenly, realizing listeners might wonder about this too. He took a slow breath. I herded cattle, fixed fences, guided trail riders. Simple work. I liked it. His expression hardened. After the raid, simple didn't exist anymore. Saharila absorbed that quietly. You lost more than family, she whispered. Yeah, he said. I lost the man I was. They looked at each other then, two people with whole lives behind them they didn't talk about, but didn't need to explain. Dawson rose, brushing dust from his knees. We move at dusk, he said. We'll follow the wash north until we hit the ridge beyond. They won't expect that path. Saharila pushed herself up, her body protesting. Dawson stepped closer, offering her his hand. She took it with hesitant trust, her fingers curling around his palm. The land outside grew quieter, the shadows lengthening across the basin. The air cooled enough to make the skin on her arms prickle. Stay close, Dawson said as they prepared to leave the shelter. She nodded. Together, they stepped out of the overhang and moved into the deepening dusk, the approaching night carrying danger, fear, and something growing between them neither had the words for yet. The last stretch of daylight disappeared behind the ridge as Dawson and Saharila followed the dry wash north, the air cooling fast and the wind pushing through the basin with a low, steady sound that made the leaves of the juniper trees tremble. The sky shifted from orange to deep blue, and long shadows covered the sand in uneven patches. Saharila stayed close to Dawson, her steps slow but determined, relying on his steady pace to keep her moving as the pain in her bruises sharpened with the colder air. Dawson checked the ground constantly, reading the soil for any sign of other riders. The evening light made tracking harder, but he trusted his memory of the wash and the terrain beyond it. When they reached a sharp bend where the rock wall tilted inward, he stopped long enough to listen. Nothing but the distant cry of a night bird and the soft thump of the horse's shifting weight. You cold? Dawson asked, noticing the way Saharila's shoulders tightened. A little, she said. Night wind strong. He opened his saddlebag and pulled out a thin wool blanket. Wrap it around yourself, he said. We'll have a fire soon if we manage to climb out of the wash before dark. She took the blanket, grateful, and draped it around her shoulders, adjusting it so it covered the torn neckline of her dress. Her eyes lingered on Dawson for a moment, sensing his fatigue even though he didn't show it openly. Listeners might have wondered earlier where Dawson's physical limits were, whether traveling alone had hardened him or worn him down. The truth became clear now. He carried exhaustion in his posture, but discipline kept him moving. Years of living on the trail had taught him to save every ounce of strength and never reveal strain unless he had no choice. Saharila touched his arm lightly. You tired too, she said softly. He gave a short nod. I'll rest when you're safe. They continued until the wash narrowed into a steep slope of loose sandstone. Dawson stopped again, assessing the climb. We go up here, he said. It'll take us to the ridge. Scouts won't waste time checking the higher ground in the dark. Saharila looked up at the slope, her breath catching. It high, she murmured, and I weak. I'll help you, Dawson said. Just follow my steps. He led the horse halfway up, then tied the reins around a sturdy jut of rock. The animal pawed the ground impatiently, but stayed put. Dawson returned to Saharila and extended his hand. Take my arm, he said. She gripped him tightly, her fingers pressing into his forearm as he guided her upward. Each step sent sharp pain through her legs, but his steady support kept her from slipping. When loose stones rolled under her foot, she stumbled, and Dawson caught her around the waist with practiced reflex, holding her firmly until she regained balance. Her breath hitched at the sudden closeness, but she didn't pull away. You're doing fine, he said quietly. Her gaze lifted to his, and for a moment the fear in her eyes softened into something warmer, something shaped by trust she didn't realize she'd given. They reached the top of the ridge just as the last blue faded into night. The wind grew colder here, sweeping across the open land and carrying the faint scent of sage. Dawson looked out over the basin below, scanning for any sign of movement. The darkness swallowed everything, but he didn't relax. He knew how tribes worked during night searches. They moved silently, using the land itself to mask their approach. Saharila sank onto a flat rock, pulling the blanket tighter. You think they close? She asked. Hard to say, Dawson replied. But they're not giving up yet. She lowered her head. If they catch me, they make me return. They think tradition more important than choice. Dawson sat beside her, resting his forearms on his knees. People use tradition to excuse a lot of things, he said. Doesn't make it right. She breathed slowly, her chest rising under the blanket. My father not alive to protect me, she said quietly. My mother gone too. No one stand for me. You're not alone tonight, Dawson said. Her throat tightened at his tone. She felt the truth in it, heavy and steady, something she wasn't used to. He pulled a small tin cup from his pack and poured a bit of water into it. Drink, he said. You need to stay hydrated. She took it, her hand brushing his. The brief contact carried warmth through her fingers that surprised her. She drank slowly, then handed the cup back. What now? She asked. We rest for an hour, Dawson said. Then we move again. I want to reach the rocks near the old water hole before dawn. There's a spot there where we can hide better. Saharila hesitated, then asked the question that had lingered since the moment he found her. Why are you not afraid to help me? My clan's strong. They have many warriors. Dawson looked out over the dark land, the wind blowing his hair around his face. I've lived through worse things in a pursuit, he said, and I've made choices I regret because I hesitated. Not doing that again. Her brow furrowed. You think saving me make up for past? He shook his head. No, nothing makes up for the past, but it keeps me from adding to it. She sat quietly, absorbing the weight of that answer. She wondered what regrets he carried. Listeners would wonder too, why Dawson blamed himself for something he didn't cause. The hints are there, but the full story hadn't surfaced yet. The ridge wind grew colder, making Saharila shiver. Dawson noticed immediately and shrugged out of his coat. He draped it over her shoulders without waiting for permission. The warmth enveloped her, the scent of leather and dust familiar already. "You freeze out here without it," he said. "What about you?" she asked. "I've been colder." She pulled the coat tighter, her fingers slipping through the worn edges. "Thank you," she whispered. He settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, but not quite. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable this time, but steady in a way that anchored them both. After several minutes, Saharilla leaned slightly into him. Not fully, just enough that her shoulder brushed his. She didn't look at him when she did it, as if pretending it wasn't intentional, but the gesture wasn't lost on Dawson. "You should try to rest," he said quietly. "With danger near?" she asked. "With me here," he answered. Her eyes softened, and she let her body relax a little more against his side, the blanket and his coat wrapped around her like a barrier against the night. Below the ridge, a distant echo of hooves drifted through the darkness, too far away to be immediate danger, but close enough to remind them the hunt wasn't over. Saharilla whispered, "They will not stop." Dawson looked toward the sound, then back at her. "Then neither will we." They sat together on the ridge as the first stars appeared overhead, the darkness curling around them, forcing their worlds closer than either expected, and binding them in a way neither had planned but neither resisted. The night deepened as Dawson and Saharilla left the ridge and moved east toward the old water hole, the moon rising low through a thin veil of clouds that made the land glow with a washed-out silver. The air grew colder still, and the wind carried the scent of dry sage and distant mesquite smoke. Dawson kept his pace firm but steady, checking over his shoulder every few steps, aware that the faint hoofbeats they heard earlier could sharpen into real danger at any moment. Saharilla leaned slightly on his arm as they descended the ridge, her legs stiff from the climb and her body heavy with exhaustion. She tried to hide how badly she struggled, but Dawson sensed it anyway. He didn't say anything. He simply adjusted his pace so she could match it without tripping, his presence acting as the balance she lacked. "Are we close?" she asked softly, her breath uneven. "Half an hour," Dawson said. "Maybe less if the ground stays firm." "Why you choose water hole?" she asked. "Why not keep riding all night?" He glanced at her. This was a question listeners would ask too. Why a man so cautious would risk stopping again when danger was still close. "Because the rocks around it form a natural shield," he explained. "Hard for trackers to see tracks on stone. And there's a narrow gap in the wall where we can stay hidden till sunrise." She nodded, trusting his judgment without hesitation. She didn't fully understand how a man who traveled alone knew these places with such precision, but the answer came when Dawson added quietly, "My father took me there once, long before the raid. It was the only spot he said he felt safe sleeping outdoors." Saharilla looked at him closely, sensing the subtle shift in his expression. He rarely mentioned his father, and when he did, the memory carried both comfort and ache. "You miss him," she said gently. He didn't look at her when he answered. Every day, they reached a stretch of uneven ground lined with boulders. Dawson guided her between them, helping her when the rocks jutted too sharply for her to step over. When she stumbled on a loose stone, he caught her elbow again, steadying her as she gasped at the sudden spike of pain. "You're running on nerves," he murmured. "Your body's done more than most could manage." "I don't want to slow you," she said, embarrassed. "You're not slowing me," Dawson replied. "You're surviving." "That's different." She absorbed those words quietly, surprised by how much they steadied her. They walked for several more minutes before the terrain dipped into a shallow basin surrounded by rock outcroppings that blocked the wind. At the center lay the water hole, nothing more than a stone-lined depression filled with a few inches of murky water, but enough for animals to drink from. The surrounding cliffs created narrow shadows where a person could hide without being seen from the basin floor. Dawson stopped at the edge. "This is where we settle for the night." Saharilla sank to her knees, letting the blanket slide from her shoulders as relief washed through her. Her body trembled from exertion, but she managed to scoop water into her palms and sip carefully. Dawson crouched beside her, refilling his canteen. "Drink slow," he said. "Your stomach won't handle too much at once." She nodded, following his instruction. Once she finished, Dawson guided her toward a tight crevice in the rock wall. The gap was narrow enough that they could slip inside only one at a time, but the space beyond opened into a small hollow sheltered from wind and sight. Inside, he said, "You'll be safer here." She stepped through the gap and found the hollow surprisingly warm compared to the open land. The stone trapped body heat well enough that the air felt less punishing. Dawson remained outside for several seconds, listening. "I'll check the ridge," he said. "Make sure no one followed." Saharilla reached out and caught his wrist. Her touch was light but urgent. "You leave me here alone?" "Only for a moment," he said gently. "I won't go far." She hesitated, then released him. Dawson disappeared from view, moving across the basin with careful steps. Saharilla remained inside the hollow, hugging the blanket close, the dark pressing around her. The quiet made her thoughts louder. The ritual she fled, the shame forced onto her, the fear of capture, and the unexpected pull she felt toward the man risking himself to protect her. She didn't understand why Dawson helped her so fiercely. A stranger had no reason to involve himself in another tribe's matters. Another man might have delivered her back for reward or favor. Dawson did the opposite. His footsteps returned moments later. When he stepped inside the hollow, she let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "No sign of them," he said. "We're good for now." She shifted slightly, making room for him in the small space. He sat beside her, their shoulders nearly touching, the warmth between them noticeable in the tight hollow. "You trust me?" he asked quietly, noticing the way she leaned closer without thinking. She looked down at her hands. "You save me from danger," she said. "You treat me with respect. You look away when my dress torn. You give your coat. You help me walk. How I not trust?" He inhaled slowly, her sincerity striking deeper than he expected. Saharilla hesitated, then asked something listeners would certainly wonder. "You ever love someone?" Dawson leaned his head back against the stone. "I did once," he said, "before the raid." "What happened?" "She got caught in the crossfire," he answered. "She wasn't supposed to be there, and I couldn't reach her in time." Saharilla's eyes softened, the weight of his grief settling between them. "You think you fail her?" she whispered. "Every night," he said. She reached out and placed her hand on his chest, right over the center where his breath moved. The touch was gentle, warm, steady. "You not fail me," she said. "Not tonight." Dawson's heartbeat tightened beneath her palm. For the first time since the raid, someone's touch didn't feel like a reminder of what he lost. It felt like a chance to protect something again. Outside, a faint echo drifted across the basin. A single hoofbeat, distant but unmistakable. Saharilla tensed. They tracked still. "Yes," Dawson said quietly, and they're closer than before. She gripped his coat tightly. "What we do?" He turned toward her, meeting her eyes with calm resolve. "We survive the night," he said, "and at first light we run again." She nodded, her breath unsteady but her trust in him unbroken. The hollow pressed them close, the darkness wrapped around them, and the sound of distant riders crept nearer as the night stretched on, binding them tighter as danger swallowed the land outside. The night deepened as Dawson and Saharilla left the ridge and moved east toward the old water hole, the moon rising low through a thin veil of clouds that made the land glow with a washed-out silver. The air grew colder still, and the wind carried the scent of dry sage and distant mesquite smoke. Dawson kept his pace firm but steady, checking over his shoulder every few steps, aware that the faint hoofbeats they heard earlier could sharpen into real danger at any moment. Saharilla leaned slightly on his arm as they descended the ridge, her legs stiff from the climb and her body heavy with exhaustion. She tried to hide how badly she struggled, but Dawson sensed it anyway. He didn't say anything. He simply adjusted his pace so she could match it without tripping, his presence acting as the balance she lacked. "Are we close?" she asked softly, her breath uneven. "Half an hour," Dawson said. "Maybe less if the ground stays firm." "Why you choose water hole?" she asked. "Why not keep riding all night?" He glanced at her. This was a question listeners would ask too. Why a man so cautious would risk stopping again when danger was still close. Because the rocks around it form a natural shield, he explained. Hard for trackers to see tracks on stone. And there's a narrow gap in the wall where we can stay hidden till sunrise. She nodded, trusting his judgment without hesitation. She didn't fully understand how a man who traveled alone knew these places with such precision. But the answer came when Dawson added quietly, "My father took me there once, long before the raid. It was the only spot he said he felt safe sleeping outdoors." Saharila looked at him closely, sensing the subtle shift in his expression. He rarely mentioned his father, and when he did, the memory carried both comfort and ache. "You miss him," she said gently. He didn't look at her when he answered. Every day, they reached a stretch of uneven ground lined with boulders. Dawson guided her between them, helping her when the rocks jutted too sharply for her to step over. When she stumbled on a loose stone, he caught her elbow again, steadying her as she gasped at the sudden spike of pain. "You're running on nerves," he murmured. "Your body's done more than most could manage." "I don't want to slow you," she said, embarrassed. "You're not slowing me," Dawson replied. "You're surviving." "That's different." She absorbed those words quietly, surprised by how much they steadied her. They walked for several more minutes before the terrain dipped into a shallow basin surrounded by rock outcroppings that blocked the wind. At the center lay the water hole, nothing more than a stone-lined depression filled with a few inches of murky water, but enough for animals to drink from. The surrounding cliffs created narrow shadows where a person could hide without being seen from the basin floor. Dawson stopped at the edge. "This is where we settle for the night." Saharila sank to her knees, letting the blanket slide from her shoulders as relief washed through her. Her body trembled from exertion, but she managed to scoop water into her palms and sip carefully. Dawson crouched beside her, refilling his canteen. "Drink slow," he said. "Your stomach won't handle too much at once." She nodded, following his instruction. Once she finished, Dawson guided her toward a tight crevice in the rock wall. The gap was narrow enough that they could slip inside only one at a time, but the space beyond opened into a small hollow sheltered from wind and sight. "Inside," he said, "you'll be safer here." She stepped through the gap and found the hollow surprisingly warm compared to the open land. The stone trapped body heat well enough that the air felt less punishing. Dawson remained outside for several seconds, listening. "I'll check the ridge," he said. "Make sure no one followed." Saharila reached out and caught his wrist. Her touch was light but urgent. "You leave me here alone?" "Only for a moment," he said gently. "I won't go far." She hesitated, then released him. Dawson disappeared from view, moving across the basin with careful steps. Saharila remained inside the hollow, hugging the blanket close, the dark pressing around her. The quiet made her thoughts louder. The ritual she fled, the shame forced onto her, the fear of capture, and the unexpected pull she felt toward the man risking himself to protect her. She didn't understand why Dawson helped her so fiercely. A stranger had no reason to involve himself in another tribe's matters. Another man might have delivered her back for reward or favor. Dawson did the opposite. His footsteps returned moments later. When he stepped inside the hollow, she let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "No sign of them," he said. "We're good for now." She shifted slightly, making room for him in the small space. He sat beside her, their shoulders nearly touching, the warmth between them noticeable in the tight hollow. "You trust me?" he asked quietly, noticing the way she leaned closer without thinking. She looked down at her hands. "You save me from danger," she said. "You treat me with respect. You look away when my dress torn. You give your coat. You help me walk. How I not trust?" He inhaled slowly, her sincerity striking deeper than he expected. Saharila hesitated, then asked something listeners would certainly wonder. "You ever love someone?" Dawson leaned his head back against the stone. "I did once," he said, "before the raid." "What happened?" "She got caught in the crossfire," he answered. "She wasn't supposed to be there, and I couldn't reach her in time." Saharila's eyes softened, the weight of his grief settling between them. "You think you fail her?" she whispered. "Every night," he said. She reached out and placed her hand on his chest, right over the center where his breath moved. The touch was gentle, warm, steady. "You not fail me," she said. "Not tonight." Dawson's heartbeat tightened beneath her palm. For the first time since the raid, someone's touch didn't feel like a reminder of what he lost. It felt like a chance to protect something again. Outside, a faint echo drifted across the basin. A single hoofbeat, distant but unmistakable. Saharila tensed. They tracked still. "Yes," Dawson said quietly, and they're closer than before. She gripped his coat tightly. "What we do?" He turned toward her, meeting her eyes with calm resolve. "We survive the night," he said, "and at first light we run again." She nodded, her breath unsteady but her trust in him unbroken. The hollow pressed them close. The darkness wrapped around them, and the sound of distant riders crept nearer as the night stretched on, binding them tighter as danger swallowed the land outside. A thin, gray light crept into the hollow long before the sun reached the horizon, turning the edges of the stone walls pale while the center remained dark. Dawson opened his eyes the moment the sky shifted color, his body reacting before his thoughts had time to settle. Saharila still rested against him, her head on his chest, her arm draped loosely across his ribs, the blanket pulled up to her chin. Her breathing was slow and steady now, softer than the tense breath she'd taken through most of the night. He didn't move right away. He gave her a minute longer, letting her body hold onto the rare calm she'd earned after hours of fear. But time wasn't theirs to take, not with men searching the ridge. When he finally spoke, he kept his voice low. "Saharila," he whispered, "it's time." She stirred slowly, blinking as her mind pulled itself from sleep. For a brief moment, she looked confused. Then she remembered where she was, why she was there, and the weight of the night pressed back into her shoulders. She pushed herself upright, wincing at the stiffness in her legs. "Did they come back?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. "No," Dawson said. "Not yet, but they will as soon as the light hits the ground." She nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. Dawson stood and stepped toward the narrow entrance of the hollow, scanning the basin. The faint glow of dawn made the water whole glisten like a dark mirror. There were no riders in sight, but just because he couldn't see them didn't mean they weren't close. He turned to her again. "We move fast," he said, "and we take a different route this time." "Which way?" she asked, her voice still heavy with sleep. "The ridgeline to the east," he said. "It's rocky, hard to track, but dangerous if you're not steady on your feet." Saharila straightened with determination. "I do it." Before they stepped out, Dawson handed her a small piece of jerky from his pack. "Eat," he said. "You need something in your stomach." She accepted the food without hesitation and chewed slowly while adjusting the torn neckline of her dress. She used the cloth he'd given her earlier to tie it under the chest, making the tear less exposed. Dawson noted the makeshift repair and the relief it gave her to not have to hold the dress closed constantly. "Better?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." They left the hollow and approached the horse, which lifted its head and nickered softly when Dawson touched its neck. Its sides had finally cooled from the long ride, but it still looked tired. Listeners might have wondered how far an overworked horse could carry two people. Dawson addressed the concern naturally. "He's strong," Dawson said as he checked the horse's legs and hooves. "But we give him breaks today. Can't push him like last night." Saharila stroked the horse's mane gently. "He save us too." Dawson gave a faint nod. "He's got more sense than most men." They mounted quickly. Saharila settled in front again, her back pressing against Dawson's chest for balance. His arm wrapped around her waist, and she rested her hands on his forearm, recognizing the stability his hold provided. The horse began climbing the eastern ridge, its hooves slipping occasionally on loose stone. Saharila held tightly to Dawson as the incline grew steeper. The wind hit them harder up here, carrying the scent of distant campfire smoke. Fresh smoke, not from last night. Saharila stiffened. "They close." Dawson inhaled, tasting the air carefully. "Less than an hour behind." She turned her head slightly toward him. "How you know?" "Because I've chased men before," he said. "And I know how a fire smells when it's been put out recently." That detail answered another silent listener question, whether Dawson had hunted people, not just cattle or raiders. He didn't say more, But Saharila understood. Dawson's past held more violence than he let on. When they reached the top of the ridge, the land opened into a flat stretch of dry rock, broken only by scattered shrubs and small cracks in the surface. Dawson guided the horse along the seam of the ridge, avoiding sand and dirt where tracks could be found. "We'll head toward the canyon fork," he said. "It splits 5 miles east. Harder to follow us there." Saharila looked out at the open land ahead. "Dawson," she said, hesitating, "what happened if we reach my uncle's territory? You think he'd protect me?" Dawson tightened his grip slightly. "You said the elders don't agree with the ritual." "They not do this," she confirmed. "Only warriors tied to the rule." "Then getting to your uncle is the best chance we have," Dawson said. "He stops the hunt, or we keep running." She absorbed that with a slow breath. "He is a strong leader. He listened when truth's spoken." Dawson nodded, relieved to hear this. "Good. Then we aim for him." The horse moved across the ridge with care. The morning light sharpened the edges of the landscape, revealing narrow gullies and old rock slides that would have been deadly in the dark. Saharila glanced back only once, scanning the basin far below. No movement, no riders. Not yet. As they reached a jagged outcrop of rock, Dawson pulled the horse to a halt. "We walk from here," he said. "Too steep for him." Saharila slid off the saddle first, using Dawson's arm for balance. The moment her boots touched the stone, a sharp pain shot up her thigh, and she gritted her teeth to keep from crying out. "You all right?" Dawson asked. "Just sore," she whispered. "I keep going." Dawson handed her a short walking stick he'd carved earlier while she slept. "Use this. Keeps weight off your legs." She took it, surprised he had prepared it without mentioning it before. "You think of everything," she said quietly. "I think of what keeps us alive," he corrected. They climbed the next section on foot, the rock rough under their boots, the wind tugging at their clothes. As Saharila moved ahead, Dawson stayed close behind, ready to catch her if she slipped. Near the top, she lost footing on a loose stone, and Dawson reached out immediately, catching her waist and pulling her close to steady her. Their faces ended up inches apart, their breaths mixing in the cold morning air. For a moment, neither moved. Saharila's hand slid up to his chest, her fingers resting over the spot where she'd felt his heartbeat last night. Dawson held her waist without letting go, his steady gaze meeting hers with quiet intensity. "You're all right," he said, his voice low. Her chest rose in a trembling breath. "Because you here." The moment lingered, warmth, fear, trust all pressed together in the narrow space between them. Then Dawson stepped back carefully. "Let's keep moving." They reached the final rise of the ridge just as a sharp whistle cut through the wind. Far away but unmistakable. Saharila froze. "That is call," she whispered. "Search call." Dawson lifted his rifle and scanned the basin below. 3 riders appeared at the far edge, moving fast across the open land. "They found the wash," he said, "and they're tracking east." Saharila gripped the walking stick tighter. "They know we climb. Then we don't stay on the ridge," Dawson said firmly. "We drop into the canyon fork before they get a clear sight." He took her hand, guiding her toward the narrow descent ahead. As the morning sun broke fully over the land, Dawson and Saharila ran for the canyon's protection. Together, breathless, hunted, and bound by a growing connection neither could deny anymore. Behind them, the hunt drew closer. Ahead of them, the 4 promised either escape or danger, and every step drove them deeper into each other's fate. The horse burst into the narrow pass just as the first of the pursuers reached the rise behind them. Sharp echoes rang off the stone walls as Dawson steered them into the tight passageway, the horse's sides brushing against the rock. Saharila ducked her head as the ridge roof closed over them for several seconds before opening into a hidden valley beyond, an untouched stretch of land shielded by high cliffs. Dawson slowed only when he was certain the enemy horses couldn't enter side by side. He turned the horse sharply and brought them behind a heavy slab of rock that concealed them from the pass entrance. Saharila breathed in fast, shaky pulls. "We lose them," she whispered. "Not yet," Dawson said. "But they can't flank us here." At the mouth of the pass, the first rider appeared, then stopped abruptly when he saw the narrow space. The man shouted something in frustration and attempted to push his horse forward anyway. The animal balked, scraping its flank on the stone, unable to squeeze through. A second rider arrived and joined the first, the two exchanging heated words in Apache. Saharila listened intently. "They argue," she whispered. "One say we must be near. Others say too dangerous to follow. They fear trap." Dawson kept his rifle lowered but ready. "If they come through one at a time, I'll deal with them." Saharila placed her hand on his arm. "No," she whispered urgently. "No more blood. I not want anyone die for me." "Then what do you want?" Dawson asked softly. She stepped out from behind the rock, just enough for the two men to see her. Not exposing herself completely, just enough to prove she wasn't captured or harmed. "Wait," Dawson began, moving to pull her back, but she raised a hand gently to stop him. The two riders froze when they saw her standing. One of them spoke to her in a low, tense voice. Saharila answered in kind. Their exchange lasted only seconds before the first rider's expression shifted, anger fading into realization. He gestured emphatically, pointing to the open land behind them. The second rider nodded, looking conflicted before turning his horse away. "What did you tell them?" Dawson asked, stepping beside her. She breathed deeply before answering. "I told them I choose my own life now. I told them if they force me back, they break clan law, not protect it." Her voice steadied. "I say my uncle would punish them for chase without permission." "And they believed you?" Dawson asked. "My uncle feared by all," she said. "They not want challenge." The two riders shouted once toward the pass, then turned their horses and rode away, their silhouettes shrinking until they vanished behind the ridge. Saharila watched them go with a tremor of relief running through her body. Dawson stepped behind her, placing a steady hand on her back. "It's over," he said quietly. She turned to him slowly, her eyes soft and full of something deeper than gratitude. "You protect me even when danger big," she said. "You give me choice when no one else ever did." "You deserved it," Dawson replied. Her hand rose, resting lightly on his jaw. Dawson held her gaze, unsure what she intended until she leaned in and pressed her lips to his, slow, warm, deliberate. Not a kiss born of fear, but one born of certainty. Her fingers curled into the collar of his coat, pulling him closer as he wrapped his arms around her waist, careful not to hurt her bruises. When they pulled back, her breath trembled. "Where we go now?" she asked softly. "That depends," Dawson said. "What do you want?" She looked into the quiet valley beyond the pass, then back at him. "I want to stay with you," she said, "if you want me." Dawson cupped her cheek, his voice low. "I do." Saharila's smile grew, fragile but real. "Then we build new life?" she whispered. "No ritual, no chase, just us." Dawson lifted her into the saddle, then mounted behind her, wrapping his arms securely around her waist, not out of necessity, but out of choice now. As they rode deeper into the valley, the sun broke over the ridge, warming the land that would become their home. For the first time in years, Dawson felt the weight in his chest lift. For the first time in her life, Saharila felt truly free. And together, they began a life shaped not by fear or tradition, but by belonging they chose.